Hi class, so this week we are on to chapter 8, memory, and a section of chapter 7, cognition. I'm going to focus the majority of my time on chapter 8. I've kind of pieced up chapter 7. We're going to get to intelligence later on. We're going to connect with cognition for this week. So let's get started. So when we think about cognition, it is one of our perspectives of psychology. It refers simply to thinking. It encompasses a couple of different things. It encompasses perception, so how I am interpreting what I'm hearing or I'm seeing, knowledge, what I've stored in my long-term memory, problem solving, prefrontal cortex, figuring things out, judgment making, using my own background information and what I'm seeing to call or make a judgment. Language, as well as memory. So memory is very dynamic. It's made up of a couple of different memory systems, and the focus of this lecture is going to be mostly about memory. When we think about memory, it is referred to as an information processing model. What that basically means is we're going to go through and pick apart how we process information. So we're going to have some terminology with that, as well as our different components or parts of memory. So when we're talking about memory, what kind of processing are we doing? The first thing we're doing is encoding, and that's basically coming across information, attending to it, and making sense of it. Some of it's going to connect to knowledge we already have. Some of it's going to be new. So how are we going to organize all that information? And that's going to be connected to moving towards long-term memory. Once we have it stored, that means it's in our long-term memory. So when you think about memory, you typically think of what we think of as long-term memory, but we've got a couple of other memory systems. Once I have it stored, I then at one point am I going to retrieve it. So somebody asked, what did you do last night? Or what was the last thing you did for your birthday? I would be retrieving that information. When we think about memory, we can kind of use the analogy of a computer, though that being said, we're not as clean as a computer. And so a myth that you'll hear is a memory is like a DVD player or rewinding a video recording. It is not at all like that. It's a lot messier, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But generally, you can think of it like a computer. So when you're typing in for your paper, that's your encoding. When you're pressing save, I realize you don't use any of those floppy disks anymore, but when you hit save, that's saving it or storing it. And at some point, you can bring that paper back up. So that's a very loose and quick version of memory. So we've got these different processings, and then we've got the different pieces of memory. So this is showing you the different parts of memory. So we've got 3 different parts of memory. We've got sensory memory, which connects to our senses, very quick. I'll talk a little bit about that. We've got short-term memory, which we're also going to refer to as working memory. It's kind of your here and now memory, and we're going to talk about that. It's called short-term because it's short-term. And then once you have stored in your brain, and you can recall at a later time, is long-term memory. The model that we're going to be referring to is the Atkinson-Shiffman model. It's called that because Atkinson and Shiffman developed the model. So we're going to look at that as we talk about these different processes. So the Atkinson-Shiffman model, all right? So I've put together your 3 different parts of memory: sensory, working, long-term, and I've connected some of those terms of encoding, storage, and retrieval. Retrieval is getting your memory out, getting your knowledge or what you've had stored out, and that's part of that working memory or short-term memory. Some researchers are going to tell you working memory and short-term memory are different. I'm going to say we're going to group them together. All right. So working memory or short-term memory is kind of that here and now. Anything you take from your memory and pull out is in your working memory. Long-term memory is what you've got stored. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this model. So this is the model, again, that's put into from your textbook. So one of the first things that we're going to need to do is we're going to have to need to attend. If you do not attend to something, you're not going to notice it. You're not going to get it into your short-term or working memory. You're not going to be able to store it into your long-term memory. We talked a little bit about attention when we talked about sensation and perception. Sometimes you can miss those things, and And so attention is a very important component. If you aren't attending to it, it's not going to be in your here and now, what you're thinking about in that short-term memory. To get things into long-term memory, sometimes we need to use rehearsal. And so we're going to talk about that as well. And I'm going to try to connect towards the end of the lecture application to study tips. So that's our 3 pieces of memory. I'm going to talk about sensory memory first. Sensory memory is the quick and senses. It catches your attention so you attend to it. So it could be something you hear. It could be something you see. So again, within sensory memory, we've got 2 different types of memory there, but I'm not going to expect you to know those. But no, fine-tuned memory researcher would differentiate between echoic and iconic, auditory and visual. So I first need to attend to it. Once I attend to it, it's going to get into my short-term memory. Short-term memory is limited duration. So we're talking about 30 seconds. So if you're ever in a conversation, you're like, oh my gosh, what were you saying? What was I saying? What was happening? You had a blip in your short-term memory or your working memory. It also has a limited capacity. So if you are being flooded with a bunch of information, you're not going to be able to attend to it now. All of it at once. So we have that limited capacity. Now, Miller would say it's 7 plus or minus 2 units. We're going to talk more about how we can bring in more and consume more in a minute, but it does have a limited capacity. And so if I were to flood you with a bunch of information, you might not get all that. And again, it's short term. So we've got to do something with it. We've got to take it from short term and put it into long-term memory. So our last part, so again, rehearsal is important. So if I was giving you a quick memory task, I could say, here's a list of words, you're going to be asked to respond to them. You might be doing active rehearsal while you're seeing the words to, again, try to get them into that long-term memory. So again, some things I already talked about: coding, working memory, short-term memory. We're going to use those same kinds of, both those things together. Think of them as the same thing. When we talk about short-term memory, again, it's 7 plus or minus 2 units or chunks. So if I were to go through and give you these digits and then ask you to recall them, I would be looking at your short-term memory or working memory. I could even make it a little harder, and I could say, I'm going to give you these digits and say them backwards. Then you've got to do some manipulating, and it makes it a little bit more challenging. Again, working memory is that here and now. And again, it's got that limited duration. How could I get these numbers in? Well, one thing I could do is something called chunking. And instead of saying 7, 8, 6, 2, 4, 1, 4, I might say 78, 62, 414. Right? Or even chunking those even into smaller chunks. Right? So again, that's something I can do to try to get more information in. Again, the backwards digit span task is I give you numbers, and then you turn around and repeat them backwards, right? So if I give you 1, 2, simple, you could say 2, 1, but it gets more complicated. When we're going through and looking at short-term memory, one thing, again, that can help us is chunking. And so that's grouping things together. So you might have heard or given a tip from professors. They're saying, or faculty are saying, preview the book or read it over or review before class. And part of that is so you have some general idea about these important points and you've got some awareness, so maybe you can kind of organize and chunk information. It's a whole lot easier if you had already taken psychology in high school to try to know, okay, I've learned some of this stuff and piece it together with prior knowledge. So that idea of building upon what you know can help you with this idea of chunking. Whereas if it's a brand new class and you've never been exposed to any of the terminology or concepts, it can be a lot more overwhelming and it's a little bit harder to organize that information, and you're going to see it's more effortful in how you process information. Again, rehearsal helps us. Rehearsal could be reviewing your notes. It could be going through and just repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. Again, if you're in that memory task, going through there. So our last component or type of memory is long-term memory. It's what you've got stored in your brain, information you can recall, information you're able to retrieve in some way. When we think about long-term memory, again, it could be technically stored up to a lifetime, though you might be like, there's stuff I've studied and I was in my brain, it's not anymore. So we'll talk a little bit about everything. It essentially has an unlimited capacity, but again, we have that issue of forgetting. We also have an issue of mixing things up and combining things. So our memory is a little bit messy and dynamic. And it's made up of different categories. So within long-term memory, you've got a bunch of different categories. So some things that are basically, you can divide it into explicit memory or implicit memory. Explicit is what you can recall, consciously aware of, like episodic memory is memory of events and episodes. Semantic memory is knowledge you have. So me knowing the characters of my favorite show, Grey's Anatomy, would be semantic memory. Me remembering particular episodes would be episodic memory. And then I have implicit long-term memory. This is called non-declarative because it's not as conscientious. It doesn't require as much effortful processing. And this could be me knowing a routine to my dance, me knowing how to throw a free throw, me knowing how to drive, walk, jump, etc. And so we're going to talk about classical conditioning and what that is and priming, but both of those would go into those category, that category of implicit memory. Your book, again, trying to organize things, gives you a hierarchy structure. So you have this overall type of memory, long-term memory. Within those, you have declarative, explicit, and non-declarative or implicit, and then some categorical, some examples within those that I had just discussed. Again, this is another way of looking at that. Same kind of idea there. So anytime you've got general skills, motor skills, cognitive skills, those things are kind of more practiced. We also see those are processed in different parts of the brain, the cerebellum. And then we see more of that awareness, the declarative memory, conscious recall is processed in the hippocampus. So those are some different parts of memory. So if I were going to ask you, when you dance, what type of memory are you relying on? Or reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, what kind of memory are you relying on? I'll give you a hint. Each one of those is an example of either explicit or implicit. So how do we get things into long-term memory? Well, one thing that's going to be very helpful for us is prior knowledge. Again, that idea, if I've read the chapter beforehand or I've seen a video on it, then when I go to read the chapter, I have some prior knowledge to make some of those connections. The other thing that's important is selective attention. If I am reading my book, but then I also have my phone out, and I also have a TV show in the background, I might not be selectively attending to my book at all, and I might not be getting very much information in. So again, this idea of attention is important. When we think about attention, we can divide it into two different types of attention. One is selectively attending to something, intentional focus. The other one is inhibition. So that's the idea of ignoring. So sometimes when you're in this life of online learning, if you're on a webinar or some sort of conference call, you might have people who accidentally unmuted. And so in that case, you've got to inhibit the background noise that they're doing and focus, selectively intend, hone in on that speaker. And so those are both worked out well. So actually, when I watch my favorite show, my husband says, I have this gift. I can do tunnel vision. I can watch my show no matter what chaos is going on in my house. I'm attending, zoning in on that show. So he's not as good as doing that. So he'll joke around with me. We also, how do we test this? Well, research-wise, we can do something called a Stroop task. So a Stroop task, it's called Stroop task because Stroop made it. But it's this idea of you're often going to have incongruency between the font color and the name of the font. So you can see the word red is in black font. The word blue is in red font. So that's incongruency. And so the idea is we want you to ignore the color. We want you to ignore the color of the font and or focus on the color of font, ignore the writing of the word, because our natural tendency once you're a fluid reader is to read the word. So in here I would say black, red, blue, orange, green, purple, instead of saying what I'm seeing. So that's the Stroop task. I have to selectively attend to the color of the font and ignore the word. If you want to know more about that, you can watch the video. I also, if you want to try it, I've got those. So go into the Google Slides and try those things. Stroop task. Another thing that we know that's important is how we encode information. So if you had already taken this class, you had a great instructor, you might say, oh, I know this, I know this, I know this, and you're not really deeply processing the information, or it's not as cumbersome for you because you have that prior information. There's oftentimes, sometimes that we do things that are pulled from our non-declarative memory. So for driving, have you ever been in a situation you've just driven yourself somewhere and you're like, how did I get here? Because you were so focused on attending to whatever was going on in your mind and you were in autopilot. So you're kind of going through that non-declarative kind of automatic processing. That's, again, not taking a lot of, it's not very effortful to process, it's automatic. So when you acquire new information, it is going to require your attention and your effort to get through it. And again, when we don't have prior knowledge, it's going to be more effortful. It's going to take us some more time and effort to be encoding in information. So when we talk about information encoding, we can kind of break it down into these three general categories. One is shallow, so it's a very, so think about it if you were, I showed you a picture on a screen or a scene, and I wanted you to tell me about it. Very shallow way would be you would just tell me the physical traits, what you were seeing. In an immediate way might be looking at category labels. Well, you showed a bunch of things, and some were related to vehicles and some were related to household products. And then a more deep processing is I'm trying to make meaning. So one of the things that I'll go through is I'll ask you when you're learning your material in this class to apply it, to connect it to your life, to connect it to information you already know. That is more deeply processing the information. The more deeply you process information, the more likely it's going to stick and it's going to get into that long-term memory. So deeper processing promotes better recall. So not superficially memorizing a term, but being able to give an example of it and to explain it and somehow connect it to your life or to some other prior knowledge you already have stored. Going through, sometimes when we want to get to that automatic processing, sometimes that's based on spacing, timing, how often you're doing, and frequency, how often you're doing it with automatic processing. So it also can be cases where you're like, oh my gosh, I know where that is in the book. I see the image, but I just can't see what the definition was or what that example was. That would be you automatically process that information. Versus effortful being much more focused. It really takes a lot of more energy and mental power from you to process that information. So obviously studying is more effortful than eating. When we're going through and trying to build the strong ways to encode, again, coding more deeply, one is to elaborate. So as you're going through and you're connecting different information throughout the different lessons you're having, you are trying to, again, connect that. How does this connect to what I know? How does this connect to my life? How does this connect to what I've already learned? How does this connect to, from what Professor Bear is saying to what's going on in the textbook? The other thing, which I had mentioned when we talked a little bit about flashcards here and there, is connecting a visual image. Anytime you can connect a visual image with a definition, with an example that helps bind the memory. It's called dual encoding theory because you're getting a visual, which is typically processed in your right hemisphere, and you're getting the language, which is typically processed in your left hemisphere, and it's binding it, it's making a stronger memory. Another one that sometimes uses different mnemonic techniques that can help when you're trying to remember things like Roy G. Biv, 4 colors of the rainbow, etc. It can also be helpful to chunk units or understand the relationship between things. So doing mind mapping or categories or hierarchies. So if you could draw out the long-term memory hierarchy to understand the relationship and know the different types of long-term memory, or doing hierarchies for what you see with strengths versus sensory memory, short-term working memory, or long-term memory. So again, this is George Miller for our processing units with a limited duration. So again, review is always great. So again, that idea of 7 plus or minus 2. And again, the importance is chunking. Someone might remember 7 digits, someone might remember 7. It's all based on, or 70, it's all based on how well they were able to chunk. So again, chunking is that way of organizing. So some mnemonics like where did that there. And again, hierarchies, figuring out relationships can really help in helping you organize information as you're learning different topics. Rehearsal is also important, and so rehearsal is going through and repeating and reviewing. So rehearsal would be going through and working through your flashcards, reviewing your notes. So even if you're reviewing your notes for 10 minutes a day, and then you're reviewing 10 minutes for each chapter, that's going to help you kind of keep that in your long-term memory. So Ebbinghaus was one of the first who did a lot of experiments with random nonsense syllables, trying to have people remember them. And one of the things is, if you don't keep up with the review, you're more likely to forget. So that's the example here. Some other things that we need to be aware of is we should be spacing things out as we're going through and rehearsing. So it's always great. Rehearse, take a break, rehearse, take a break, rehearse. It's better to review 10 minutes 5 days a week than spend one day of 50 minutes kind of thing. Serial possession effect is another thing that's interesting. You typically remember the beginning and the end. And it's harder to remember middle items. So in class, when we're face to face, I typically will do a memory test with showing you a bunch of words, and then I have people graph it. And we see that people tend to report higher, more likely to report the beginning and the end. And so we call this the primacy and recency effect. And so primacy is think of like primary grades early on and recently. And so this connects to our two of our types of memory. Primacy, why would we have remembered the words at the beginning of the list? Most likely because we rehearsed them. They got the most rehearsal time, so they were able to get into long-term memory. Why would we remember the words that just happened? They are still in working memory, short-term memory. So again, this is the idea of the serial position effect. So we typically remember, so on one side of the graph is probability of recall. So, around 82% of the people responded and got the first word of the list correct. And again, serial order is the idea that I will look at word one. How many people got word one? Word two. How many people got word two, etc. And then I had a list of 17. I'd see about 90 something, 93% maybe had remembered that last word. And again, that last word was still in your working memory, so you might have jotted it down really quickly. And so again, we typically see this. And this is also true if you think about it. Sometimes when you're reading through books or recalling movies, things like that, we tend to remember the beginning and the end. So that's the primacy and recency effect. Again, some review of these different processing. So things can happen when we try to remember things, this idea of retaining information. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So when we retrieve things, sometimes we can either recall them or recognize. Recall would be, I would ask you, who was the person who first started studying rehearsal for psychology and memory? And so if you could recall that, then that would be recall. Or I could give you a multiple choice question. Is it Pavlov? Is it Ebbinghaus? Is it William Wundt? And so then that would be recognition, the idea of multiple choice. And there are cases where when we're trying to encode something, we could encode it more shallow or more deep. And sometimes it helps when you get a cue, you're able to then remember it. And again, that connects to how long-term memory is organized. So example recognition, maybe you can figure out which coin is the coin that we typically have, right? So you can read the book to find out more about that. That was figure 8.14. And so that's a nickel you got there. And then the capital of France is blank. And again, any type of fill in the blank test is recall. Any multiple choice is recognition. So again, which do you think is easier and why? So I'll have you kind of pause and think about that based on what you know about our properties of memory. So one of the things that we're going to see is a general way of how we organize information is retrieval cues. So this idea of, oh, if you could tell me something associated, trying to remember an individual's name, tell me more about the person, tell me what they look like. give me the first letter of their name. Again, that's trying to get the way your brain is organized is trying to get at that word. So we've got these different associations. And so I could have, again, your associations are based on schemas. And schemas are talked about in chapter 7, but it's groupings of information. So you have, this is an example of a schema of a fire truck. You have associations of how you describe things, kind of how how your information is organized is in schemas. And then script is a special type of schema. It's an event schema. So those are ways we learn to associate. Your book in chapter 7 also talks about prototypes as well. Some things that it can help us remember is context cues. And so they've done silly studies like have people learn words in water or on land. And then they went to see if you learned it in water and you recalled it in water, was that better than learning it on land and recalling it in water? Example, etc. So you can see here, we learn best when we learned on land and recalled on land. Part of that is that's a natural context for us, where it's a more familiar environment. And then it's also the case that if it's the same, we learned on water and recalled it on water, that was also more beneficial for word recall tasks that they had done. This isn't to say, well, it would give one application of this is where you study and where you're learning in this class, take the test, which kind of fits because you probably are using the same devices. Though don't rely just on that to do well in your classes. But it is interesting to know we have context effects. We also have moods as retrieval cues, so we call this state-dependent memory. You might have recognized this before. You are in a bad mood, and all of a sudden you start recalling all these other terrible things. So those are called mood congruent memories. And it's also the case when you start thinking about happy events, you might also start remembering those happier times. So again, mood can be a retrieval cue as well. When we're thinking about retrieval, we also have special cases. So autobiographical memories are memories about our own personal lives. And we typically see it as you remember more at the beginning of your life. Beginning of your life, though, is usually 3 to 5 is when you have your first memories because it's connected to language. And then you've got more memories, and then you kind of have less memory, strong memories during that older age. So you have this kind of reminiscence as well. We also tend to remember general events. So thinking about kind of generally how you do things week to week. You might also have event-specific information. So what happened on that 21st birthday, or what happened on your 16th birthday, or at graduation, or your wedding, or the birth of your first child, etc. We also know that emotion places different context on memory. So if you remember the midbrain, we've got the hippocampus and the amygdala in there, and the amygdala is emotion. And we see interesting things based on emotion. So some emotional events are called flashbulb memories because if you think about it, you feel like you're right there. And so a lot of people have flashbulb memories for 9/11 with the Twin Towers. Another flashbulb memory might when you hear about a big news event. So maybe the passing of RGB, if you that was someone who was important to you. So flashbulb memories are kind of important when you think about it, you're like revisiting that time period. We also see traumatic events. Sometimes we see dampening of emotions, memories for that. Sometimes we have strong memories for that. Again, there's a lot of complexities with trauma and memory in a really interesting area of psychology and memory to study. And then we also have repressed memories, so memories you don't remember. So it could be motivational. You decided not to remember that because it's been a painful memory, etc. It also could be recovered at some point. So again, we're going to talk a little bit more about forgetting, but there's a lot of complexities when we think about the way our brain remembers and stores and reconstructs information. And we do have more of a constructivist memory. What I mean by that is we can mold it and shape it. It's not recorder. There's also cases where we can have memories that are totally off. And so your book talks about this as well. But there's cases where people have been tried saying, an eyewitness saying, I saw that person commit that crime or do that, or the person's recognized in a lineup. And then um, found guilty, and then only years later to be exonerated by DNA, because DNA really shows the hard evidence. And so there's some really interesting things. If you want to Google the Innocence Project, there's some follow-up with that. But it really is unfortunate. Our memories are not perfect. They can be construed, and they're not always accurate. So it's a tricky thing with eyewitness testimony and thinking about memory and law for those of you interested in criminal psychology. Loftus is a really key researcher in eyewitness testimonies. You can read more about that in the book. But even changing wording can mess up people's recall. So that's a study that was done with seeing an seeing an accident and then changing the word. Did they smash? Did they collide? Did they bump? Did they hit? Did they contact? And then how fast of the speed they reported that person was going in these studies. So forgetting is a really complicated thing. We can forget at 3 different levels. We can forget at encoding. Was it really encoded very well? More shallow. We can forget at storage. Wasn't really rehearsed very well. We change it up at retrieval because new information's come in and kind of muddled up that memory. So lots of different things can happen during that forgetting. So one of the most general things is we see if it's not retrieved, if it's not recalled, you are likely to forget it. And so that's a case of it's not, the storage kind of gets lost and muddled, and it's harder to retrieve. So typically we have those retrieval failures at the working memory. I just can't recall it. Sometimes you have something called tip of the tongue where you're like, oh, I know it, and we've got this, and I know a little bit about this, but I just can't reach it. I will say if that ever happens to you, take a deep breath, think about something else, go back to it in situations, because sometimes you can stress yourself out again with the midbrain and the frontal lobe, that it prevents you from thinking clearly to get to it. And it might be later on you're like, oh yeah, it was this was the person's name, or that was what the answer was. So again, retrieval challenge can be tip of the tongue. So tip of the tongue again is where if you have context, sometimes you can reach that schema and get to it. We also have cases where we can reconstruct our memories. So we call this the misinformation effect. So you might have a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, did I dream it? Did someone tell me that? Did we experience it? Or you might be recalling an event with someone and they're like, that's not what I remember happening. So again, this idea of socialization of memory, reconstruction of memory can be influenced. And you can also remember things differently. So you might have this great memory while you're dating someone, and then you break up, and then you start switching it around and focusing on maybe the negative qualities of that individual. So again, very complex things with memory going on there. Some other things that can be challenging with memory is proactive interference and retroactive interference. And this is information getting in the way. It's either information that you had before that interferes with new information. So when you have new information interfering with old, that's proactive. When you have new information that messes up your old information and confuses you, that's retroactive. And so those are 2 different types of interference that can muddle you up. So sometimes when students take my stats class and they're also taking another math class, sometimes they're like, is this something we learned about, or is this something else? And so I've got to kind of realign them, hone in on what the content is for my stats class. So again, some things that we know is sleep can help prevent retroactive interference. And so part of that is you sleep on it. So study, get your sleep, wake up and take the test. You don't have anything to be interfering with you having just remembered that. Again, don't totally lean on that, but it is something interesting to know. These are some different types of forgetting, just for you to know. I'm not going to dig deep and test you on different types of forgetting, but to know it's very complex, just like memory is very complex, forgetting also very complex. So that you can pause that or look at the Google Slides and get some examples of that. So let's wrap up with some quick study tips. So 1, reviewing your notes routinely is part of that rehearsal. And also this idea of checking for errors. So metacognitively, so metacognition is knowing about your cognition. If I take notes during the video, does what I wrote down connect and map well with what's in the book or the video that Dr. Bear had me see. You can also do something if you've got, if you've made flashcards. So quick thing is, every time we go through key terms, try to do at least 10 quick flashcards for yourself. Again, you can use Quizlet, you can make them in the Google Slides, you can do them on paper. On paper, you can reorganize your flashcards into, again, those hierarchies or networks or things that are connected as you're going through. And that can help as well and kind of deepen those processes with that rehearsal. When you're in learning mode, so when you're watching these videos and reading your book, again, undivided attention, selective attention. Try to avoid distractions where you'd have to inhibit other stuff. And then the idea of processing deeply is connecting to prior knowledge, connecting to your own life. Again, making those associations, again, is more deeply processing. Using imagery connects to that dual encoding. So draw pictures and doodle. I tell my students that's great to do. Just make sure your doodles are connected to what you're also taking notes on. And then chunking is this ability to connect information. And then the idea of encoding early and often is get going on this material and review it and review it and review it. So this idea of rehearsal, again, if you redo your notes, that can be a good thing. I will tell students sometimes to do a brain dump. So after you finish this lecture, what did you take away from it? What are you writing down? Those are things you've already got into your long-term memory, and you kind of revisit. Anytime you can talk about this class with someone in the class or a family member or friends or me in office hours or check-in hours, that helps you connect. Again, testing yourself, the use of flashcards helps you identify what you know, what you don't know, or what you know well, what you need to focus more on. And then the idea of resting and eating well is part of taking care of yourself and self-care. And sleep helps, again, keep you up on your toes and alert during this learning process. With retrieval, again, anytime you can give yourself context or cues. So again, a lot of my tests are multiple choice, not to torture you, but to help make things a little bit easier. And again, being comfortable and calm connects to that parasympathetic system, so you're not shoving off that prefrontal cortex and you being able to problem solve. These are just general slides for some terminology that's discussed in chapter 7. And then of course I have key terms. We do have a lot of key terms here. Again, once we get to the study guide, I might narrow down on some of these. Again, if you have any questions or need some additional help, let me know. Thanks for listening.